The first thing I heard was my own breath, sharp and loud inside the freezing air. Outside the hangar, headlights cut through the dark like silent searchlights. No one spoke. No one had to. We all knew this wasn't a drill. A man I'd never seen before pressed a sealed envelope into my hand. He didn't wait for me to open it. He just walked away fast, like standing next to me was dangerous. The paper inside was thin, but it felt heavier than anything I'd carried in the field. One line, no signature, just a destination, and a time that was already too close. Back then, the badge meant you'd move without asking why. And I moved. Before I regret saying any of this, hit that like button. Subscribe if this already makes you uncomfortable, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Washington, D.C., January 1965. The call didn't come through a phone. Phones could be tapped, even ours. It came in the form of a ciphered cable slipped under my door at 5:42 a.m. Berlin time. I knew the hour because I was already awake, watching the frost on the window glass. The cable's header was nothing unusual, standard encryption, standard clearance code, but the body was different. No formal greetings, no coordinates, no cover story. Just immediate travel to Washington, D.C., priority 1. Whoever had typed it didn't want to leave a trace of the Y. By 7 a.m., I was at Tempelhof Airport. The station chief was waiting by the gate, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the tarmac, like he wished I wasn't there. He didn't ask how fast I could be ready. He just handed me a one-way ticket and muttered, "Don't lose that envelope." On the flight, I couldn't stop replaying the moment he passed me the ticket. Not the gesture, the pause. A fraction too long, like he'd almost said something else. I'd learned to pay attention to those pauses. Landing at Dulles, the cold was different. Clean, surgical. A black sedan was parked right at the bottom of the steps. No signs, no identification. Just a driver in an unmarked coat who opened. Back door without a word. Inside the car, there was another envelope, thicker this time, sealed with red wax. I ran my thumb over it. Not military, diplomatic. That meant the chain of hands it had passed through was already too long. The driver never looked back as we left the airport. He kept a steady pace, ignoring every light, every horn. He didn't take the direct route. The detours told me he was checking if we were being followed. Either that, or he wanted me to think we were. We reached the Potomac in under an hour. From there, we slowed. The streets were empty, but I felt eyes on us. Washington wasn't my city, but I knew the weight of surveillance when it settled over your shoulders. We stopped at a side entrance to the White House complex, one I didn't even know existed. A guard glanced at me, then at the envelope. He didn't ask for ID. He just pressed a button, and the gate slid open. Inside, a man in a dark suit took the envelope from my hands before I could even step out of the car. He leaned in and said, "Lo, you're late." I wasn't, which meant someone wanted me to feel like I was. And that's how I knew this wasn't just another operation. This was the kind you don't brief, you bury. And that wasn't the strangest thing that happened that day. The door to the Oval Office opened without ceremony. No introductions, no tour, just the quiet thud of the latch closing behind me. The room looked exactly like the photos, polished, symmetrical, presidential. But the air was colder than it should have been, like the windows had been left open a moment too long. A man from the Secret Service, thin, pale, with the kind of haircut that made you forget his face, stood by the resolute desk. His hand rested on the wood, fingers tapping a slow, uneven rhythm. When I stepped closer, he stopped tapping and gestured to a section of the front panel. "Right here," he said, barely above a whisper. A grain of the oak was smooth everywhere, except that one spot. The varnish caught the light differently, like it had been polished more often or more recently than the rest. I knelt down. From that angle, I could see it, a faint line, almost. Invisible as you knew it was there, not a scratch. A seam. The agent didn't explain how they'd found it. Instead, he slid a thin metal probe into the line, and the panel gave way with a soft click. Inside was darkness, and then when he tilted a small flashlight, a glint of something that didn't belong in a piece of Victorian furniture. Metal, curved and tight-fitted, the size of a cigarette pack, but with no visible screws or power source. I didn't touch it. I didn't have to. I'd seen enough field devices to know this was something else. Picked up a spike on our sweep, the agent muttered. But it's not active. At least, not now. That, at least, wasn't for my comfort. It was for his. I asked for the timeline. He gave me none. I asked who else knew. He looked at the ceiling instead of my face. That was answer enough. From behind me, I heard footsteps measured, deliberate. A man in a tailored suit walked past without acknowledging me, went straight to the desk and closed the panel. He didn't look at the agent either. "Don't write this down," he said. Then he left, the door clicking shut behind him. That should have been the end of it. But the panel wasn't the only thing in that room that didn't belong. They brought me to a secure room 2 floors below ground level. The kind of place where the walls seem to lean in on you, painted the same dull gray as the filing cabinets. A folding table sat in the center, and on it, the device from the desk now, sealed inside a transparent case. I'd expected wires, a battery compartment, maybe a microtransmitter. Instead, it looked like a polished metal capsule, perfectly sealed, no visible openings. You could hold it in your palm and still have room for a coin. One of the technicians, a man with the eyes of someone who didn't sleep much, spoke without looking at me. "It doesn't need power, not in the way you think." He pointed to a sheet of readings on the table frequencies captured over the past 24 hours. "It pulls energy from the room. Vibrations, heat, movement, whoever built it. Wasn't working off our textbooks." I knew of Soviet devices like this, rumors, really referenced only in obscure training memos. Resonance transmitters, so-called passive bugs. The kind you could plant and forget for decades. If this was what I thought it was, then someone had been listening to conversations in that room since before I even joined the service. Asked the obvious question, "How long has it been here?" The tech gave a thin smile. "That depends. How far back do you want to be scared?" His joke fell flat. No one in the room laughed. I leaned in closer to the casing. The surface of the capsule was warm, faintly, like it had been resting against human skin. That made no sense. We'd removed it hours ago. From the corner of the room, another voice spoke, someone I hadn't noticed until then. "We'll run." A full dismantle. I shook my head. "You won't find anything inside." He frowned. "Why?" "Because the people who make these don't hide secrets in the wiring. They hide them in the history of where it's been." The room went silent. They knew I was right. That was when I started thinking less about what the device was, and more about who had the reach to put it there. The meeting was in one of those long, narrow conference rooms where every chair feels like it's facing the wrong direction. A dozen people sat around the table, uniforms, suits, a few faces. I knew from classified files, not hallways. The device was absent. Instead, a single photograph of it lay in the center, like a piece of evidence no one wanted to touch. The president entered without announcement, flanked by 2 advisors. No one stood. No one was told to. He sat at the head of the table, hands folded, eyes scanning the photo without a flicker. A colonel from the Air Force broke the silence. "We need to know how it got there." That was as far as he got before someone from the State Department interrupted. "The question is who had access." The air in the room changed. You could feel it like static before a storm. "That's when A man from Naval Intelligence leaned back in his chair and said, "Maybe the better question is, who put it there?" Every head turned toward the president. He didn't move, didn't blink. His gaze drifted to the far wall, where a large map of Europe hung under glass. The silence stretched. I'd been in plenty of rooms where secrets were. Currency. But here, his secret was a weapon, and no one dared aim it. Finally, the president spoke, but not to answer. "This discussion is off record. Understood?" Murmurs of agreement circled the table. My pen stayed in my pocket. I looked back at the map. The colors, the lines, the pins, they weren't just for reference. Something about the way they were arranged was deliberate, almost coded. And the president's eyes had fixed on a single spot in the middle of the Atlantic. I didn't know why that mattered yet, but I was sure I'd find out. They cleared the room without ceremony. No handshakes, no lingering. I was given a slim dossier stamped "Eyes Only" and told to work alone. Inside, it wasn't blueprints or schematics, it was a timeline. The life of the Resolute desk, from its first assembly to its arrival in Washington. The trail began decades earlier in a British shipyard. Built from oak, salvaged from an Arctic exploration vessel, the desk was meant as a diplomatic gesture, a symbol of endurance and goodwill. It had crossed the Atlantic by ship, escorted under naval watch, and arrived in the United States untouched. At least, that's what the official record claimed. One entry caught my attention. Temporary storage, North Atlantic Port Facility, 72 hours. No details, no sign-off. Just a gap in the chain of custody. The port was in a European country listed as an ally. I'd been there before, and I remembered the place for two things: its overstaffed customs office and its chronic lack of oversight after dark. I traced the route on the map in my head. The desk's journey made sense until it reached that port. Then, the timing got strange. The ship docked at night, and instead of continuing the next morning, it sat idle for 3 days. The log showed maintenance inspection. But the crew manifest didn't match the departure manifest. 3 names had been replaced by others' men, with no recorded service history. I knew those kinds of ghosts. They belonged to someone's intelligence service. The question was whose. The last page of the dossier was a grainy photo dock workers loading a large crate into a warehouse. The edges of the image were torn, as if cropped from something larger. The faces were too blurred to identify, but the uniforms weren't. They weren't American. And they weren't Soviet? That left one possibility, and it wasn't going to look good on paper. The next file they slid across my desk wasn't from Langley. It was from the archives of the Foreign Service. That alone told me this wasn't meant to circulate widely. The cover letter was short. Gift from the government of redacted to the President of the United States, commemorating bilateral cooperation. No date of origin. No manufacturing record. Beyond the British shipyard, the seal on the page looked fresh, like someone had re-stamped it in recent years to make it look official. I flipped through the supporting documents. Diplomatic cables, press clippings, photographs of smiling officials shaking hands. All theater. Buried in the stack was one customs form from that North Atlantic port, the only one not written in English. The signature at the bottom was familiar. I'd seen it years ago on a completely different kind of document. A transit manifest for electronic components, seized from a Soviet trawler. Clicked hard. The port inspector who had signed off on the desk's transfer was the same. Man who'd accidentally misplaced classified shipments before. The thought didn't sit well. The Soviets planting a device was one thing, it was the game. But an ally standing next to us in every photograph, facilitating it? That was something else entirely. I called an old contact in naval intelligence. Didn't tell him what I had, just gave the name and asked how deep it went. His answer came back, an hour later, in the form of silence. A silence that said, Stop digging, but once you start connecting threads, it's hard to stop pulling. Every diplomatic meeting, every trade exchange, every goodwill visit between Washington and that friendly government, it all looked different. Now, like a smiling mask that didn't quite fit, I sat back, staring at the gift photo. All those speeches, all those toasts. And in the middle of it all, a desk built to carry history. And something else inside it. That was when the cold hit me, not the kind outside, but the kind that comes when you realize the people standing closest to you have the sharpest knives. The orders came quietly, no written trace, just a verbal instruction in an unmarked corridor. Berlin, eyes on the redacted embassy. Don't get seen. No mention of the desk, no mention of the device, but the timing told me everything I needed to know. They wanted confirmation, not theory. I set up across the street in an abandoned apartment. The building had been empty since '61, when the law went up and gutted half the neighborhood. The rooms smelled of dust and damp plaster, but the vantage point was perfect. 2 tall windows faced the embassy's side entrance, a narrow door. The public never used. My kit was standard. A pair of high-gain directional microphones disguised as radiator pipes, and a camera rig small enough to mount inside a gutted radio. From that room, I could hear the scrape of a chair leg inside their offices if the night was still enough. The embassy itself was a study in caution, curtains always drawn, exterior lights left dim. Guards rotated in pairs, each doing lazy figure eights. On the courtyard, too relaxed for a post this important, which told me they either thought they were untouchable or someone had told them they were. For the first week, nothing happened. Routine in, routine out. Cars arriving in daylight, leaving. Before sunset, the few night movements were dull delivery trucks, an occasional courier. I documented it all, knowing that 90% of this work was just waiting for the other 10% to happen. It was during the second week that I noticed him. A tall man, maybe early 40s, moving with the kind of stiffness you only get from military habits you can't shake. He wore civilian clothes, but the cut of the jacket was wrong, too rigid, like it was hiding a sidearm or a comms unit. He never came through the main gate, always the side door, always after midnight. Using the directional mic, I caught fragments of his movements, muffled greetings, the thud of a heavy case being set down, the click of a lock from inside the embassy. He stayed no longer than 20 minutes each time, never spoke above a murmur, never lingered. I logged his appearances. 3rd night in a row and a gap, then twice more in the same week. Whoever he wasn't part of the normal rotation. I sent the recordings to Langley through a dead drop near Friedrich Strage. 2 days later, I got a message back, handwritten in block letters. Continue observation. Do not engage. That kind of caution meant one of 2 things they were building. A bigger picture, or they were afraid of what would happen if we pushed. By the 4th week, my apartment felt like a tomb. The only life came from the embassy's lights flicking on and off at odd hours. I'd started marking the times, trying to find a pattern. The tall man's visits lined up with no official schedule, no public events, nothing that could be passed off as coincidence. One night, a different detail caught my attention. Just before the man arrived, another figure stepped outside, a young aide in a pressed uniform coat. He lit a cigarette, glanced down the street twice, and tapped the side of his shoe against the curb. A signal, too subtle for a casual smoker, too deliberate for chance. The tall man appeared within seconds, carrying a slim black briefcase, not leather metal, with reinforced corners. I recognized it instantly. It was the same design used by KGB liaison couriers in Europe. I'd seen one cracked open before. The compartments inside were designed to hold small transmitters, microfilm, even currency stacks, each under a false bottom. From my vantage point, I got a clear shot as he passed under. The lamp. His face was sharp, high cheekbones, a thin scar just under his right ear. He didn't look up, didn't scan the street too disciplined for that, which meant he either trusted his escort completely, or he already knew I was there and didn't. Cared out when he left. 20 minutes later, the case was gone. I recorded the entire exchange, every second of his approach and departure. When I developed the photos, the scar stood out even more. I dug through old files until I found it the same man, in a grainy surveillance shot from Moscow in '59. Back then, his cover had been cultural attach. This was no cultural visit, and it was no coincidence. That night, as I packed the film canisters for transfer, I realized something that made the air in that room feel heavier. If the man in those photos was who I thought he was, then the embassy I'd been watching wasn't just an Allies territory. It was a staging ground. And I wasn't the only one running surveillance in Berlin that winter. The cold had settled into the city like it meant to stay. Every breath fogged the glass of my vantage point, forcing me to wipe it clear with my sleeve every few minutes. The embassy courtyard below was quiet, the kind of quiet you don't trust. My notes from the past week all pointed to one thing. The tall man wasn't coming alone anymore. It was 1:17 when the first movement broke the stillness. A sedan approached without headlights, rolling slow along the curb before stopping at the side entrance. The driver stayed inside, engine low. A figure stepped out of the back shorter than the tall man, broader in the shoulders, moving with purpose. He carried a briefcase identical to the one I'd seen before. Same black metal, same reinforced corners. But this man didn't head inside. He handed it directly to the aide waiting at the door. The aide glanced over his shoulder twice up the street, then toward the main gate, before disappearing inside. Less than a minute later, the tall man emerged from the shadows of the courtyard. No coat, just a suit. His pace was unhurried, but his eyes swept the street in a single practiced motion. He wasn't looking for threats. He was checking for witnesses. I adjusted the focus on my camera and caught his face clean under the single lamp by the gate. The scar under his ear was unmistakable. His expression was flat, but there was something in the way he held his jaw tight, controlled, like he was forcing himself not to look toward my building. Inside the embassy, the lights flickered once, then steadied. To the directional mic, I caught faint metallic clicks, cases being opened, compartments shifting. Then a scrape, like a chair being dragged. Voices followed, low and fast, speaking in a language I knew wasn't German. The consonants were clipped, the cadence too deliberate. Russian. At 1:33, the aide reappeared, holding the now empty briefcase. He placed it in the hands of a different man at the doorway, someone I hadn't seen before. The exchange was quick, and the case was gone into the sedan without hesitation. The tall man stayed inside for another 15 minutes. When he finally emerged, he carried nothing. He stopped at the threshold, lit a cigarette, and exhaled slowly before stepping into the night air. The driver's door of the sedan opened slightly, just enough for him to glance in, and then closed. The car drove away without him. That detail stuck with me. Couriers and liaisons don't get left behind unless they're staying for something more important. I shifted to the other window, tracking him as he walked along the side street. No escort, no vehicle, just the sound of his shoes on wet pavement. He turned a corner toward an alley that led deeper into the district, an area I knew well enough to avoid at night. It wasn't on his usual route, against my better judgment. I moved down the stairs, out the side door of my building, keeping to the shadows. The cold bit into my fingers, but I kept my grip on the small 35mm camera in my coat pocket, reached the mouth of the alley just in time to see him stop beneath a dim security light. He pulled a folded envelope from his jacket and slid it into A narrow slot in the wall, an old milk chute that hadn't been in use for years. He tapped the wall twice, glanced over his shoulder, and walked away without breaking stride. I waited a full minute before approaching. The envelope was gone. Back at my post, I processed the photos from the night. The grain was heavy in the low. Light, but the sequence told its own story. The briefcase handoff, the aide's movements, the tall man's walk to the alley. Enough to raise questions, dangerous ones, if the right people saw them. I sent the roll to Langley through the Friedrich Strage drop. No message, no context. Just images. 2 days later, I got my reply in the form of a single note tucked into my ration delivery. Do not pursue further. End observation. It read like an order, but it felt like a warning. That night, I kept the blinds drawn. Not because I was afraid of being seen, but because I was starting to think the real danger wasn't across the street. It was the people who'd told me to stop looking. The embassy had gone quiet for days. No side door activity, no night deliveries, not even the usual flicker of lights at odd hours. It was the kind of stillness that felt staged, like they knew someone was watching and wanted them to get bored enough to leave. I didn't leave. Instead, I went back to my own archives. Old field reports, grainy photographs, incident logs from cities where half the people you met were working for the other half. I was looking for a name to put to the scarred face I'd seen so clearly under that lamp. It took me 3 nights of cross-checking microfilm and pulling contacts on a secure. Lying before I found it in a 1959 counterintelligence file marked inactive. The man's cover back then was cultural attach to the Soviet mission in Moscow. His real designation, noted only once in the file, was intermediary class liaison, the kind of operative used to pass material between embassies without. Drawing heat. The file claimed he'd been reassigned to a harmless trade post after '62. That was a lie. I had photos from Paris in '63 showing him shaking hands with a KGB resident. Both men were laughing. I brought the evidence to a contact in another agency. Not someone from my chain of command, a man I trusted to tell me the truth, even if it hurt. He didn't look at the files for more than 30 seconds before closing the folder and sliding it back. "Burn this," he said. "If you keep it, you'll wish you hadn't." That was the problem with truth in Berlin. Once you had it, you had to decide if it was worth keeping. I didn't burn it. I filed it under a false name and kept digging. My next step was to check old surveillance logs from the Friedrich Strage drop, back when it had been a contested point between us and the Soviets. I wanted to see if the scarred man's movements matched any known transfer dates. They did. Too well. His appearances in Berlin aligned perfectly with shipments that had gone missing from Allied diplomatic cargo electronics. Precision. Instruments, even crates labeled as art shipments. One log entry from 1960 stood out. A crate stored for 48 hours in the same North Atlantic port where the desk had lingered. No destination listed. Just a handler code that matched a known Soviet operative embedded in that port's customs office. It wasn't just that the tall man had been there. It was that he'd been there every time something important had to vanish. In plain sight, the next move was riskier. I sent a discreet request through an old station network for any photographs of the embassy staff taken in the last 6 months. I expected a handful. I got 3 dozen, most of them useless group shots, from official receptions. But there, in the background of one poorly lit banquet photo, was the scarred man standing just behind the ambassador, half in shadow, as if he didn't belong in the picture at all. I knew that pose. It was the same stance he took outside. Side door, close enough to act, but far enough to vanish if someone raised a camera. By now, the connections were too clear to ignore. The desk, the port, the embassy, the scarred man, they were all points on the same map. and the lines between them didn't run through Moscow or Washington. They ran through a so-called ally. That night, I stayed off the radio. I didn't want a single trace of what I'd found making its way through official channels. I wasn't sure if I was protecting the evidence or myself. Before turning in, I went back through the banquet photo, zooming in as far as the grain would allow. Scarred man's eyes worked on the ambassador. They were looking straight at the camera, straight at whoever had taken the shot. And the more I stared at that face, the more certain I became that he wasn't just another piece of the puzzle. He'd been watching the people trying to solve it, maybe even waiting for them to get close. Enough to remove. It occurred to me then that all these years I'd been taught to look for the enemy across the border. But in Berlin, the border was never the real problem. It was the doors we thought were locked and weren't. The reply from Langley arrived 3 days later, not through the usual coded channel, but hand-delivered in a plain envelope by a courier I'd never seen before. No call sign, no recognition phrase, just a knock on the door, a handoff, and footsteps fading down the stairwell. That alone told me the message wasn't routine. Inside, a single sheet. No header, no signature, just typed words. Cease all activity. Archive material. Do not initiate further contact. I read it twice. There was no ambiguity. They weren't asking, they were shutting it down. In the field, we used to joke that when a case got too close to the truth, the paperwork got heavier. But this wasn't about paperwork. This was about burying something so deep it wouldn't resurface for decades, if ever. I didn't stop. Not right away. I spent another day in my Vantage apartment, watching the embassy windows for the faintest sign of movement. Nothing. Curtains stayed closed. Courtyard stayed empty. Even the side entrance, once the busiest point after midnight, looked abandoned. The next night, I found out why. A black sedan, different from the usual, pulled up at the embassy's front gate just before midnight. Out stepped a man I recognized from a debrief years earlier. Mid-level State Department liaison with a talent for smoothing over misunderstandings between allies. He wasn't supposed to be in Berlin. He didn't go inside. Instead, a suited embassy official came out to meet him. They exchanged no words, only a briefcase, leather this time, not metal. The liaison opened it just enough for me to see the edge of an envelope inside, thick and cream-colored, the kind used for official agreements. The case was shut quickly, clasped tight, and handed back to the embassy man, who disappeared through the front door. The liaison got into the sedan and drove away, his face lit briefly by a street lamp comb, almost smug. The next morning, the embassy's side entrance came alive again. Cleaning staff, minor officials, all smiling too much, moving too casually. It was the performance you put on when you know the play is over and the audience has left. That afternoon, I received another delivery, this time from my own station chief. A sealed pouch containing every photograph, recording, and log I'd submitted over the past month. No note, no explanation. Just my work, sent back to me like a box of personal effects from a soldier who didn't make it home. I knew the meaning. The material wasn't going into evidence. It was going into a cabinet somewhere, filed under a label designed to make no one open it. You learn to read the unspoken in this business. And what I read here was simple. Someone had been paid, whether in favors, in leverage, or in something that didn't leave a paper trail, to keep this off the record. I locked the pouch in my own secure case. If they wanted to erase the trail, they'd have to come to me for the last copy. And if they did, at least I'd know for certain which side of this I was standing on. That night, sitting in the cold apartment, I poured the last of my whiskey into a chipped glass and stared across the street at the embassy. The lights in one second-floor room burned late, casting long shadows against the curtains. I couldn't see the people inside, but I didn't have to. I already knew who they were. Working for Dot, and it wasn't us. Berlin bars had a way of swallowing noise. The one I chose that night was dim, its windows fogged from the heat inside. Cigarette smoke drifted above the tables, clinging to the low ceiling. I sat in the far corner, back to the wall, a habit I'd never shaken. The glass in front of me was half empty when he arrived. He didn't ask if he could sit, just slid into the chair opposite me. An old contact, Soviet side, the kind of man who knew which truths could buy him a favor and which could get him killed. His coat was wet from the snow, his eyes clear and steady. "You've been looking at the desk," he said, no preamble. I didn't answer. He smiled faintly, reached into his coat, and placed a matchbox on the table. The cardboard was soft with age. "It wasn't your people who missed it," he continued. "It was never meant to be hidden from you." I turned the matchbox over in my hand. No markings, just a small, precise cut along one side. Inside, not matches, thin slivers of polished metal, curved like the interior shell of something larger. "That's from it," he said. "The device. I took it out myself." I set the box down slowly. "When?" "Before it ever touched American soil." He leaned back, watching me take that in. The gift was arranged years earlier. The port, the inspection, all theater. The ones who placed it weren't Russians. I let him talk. He told me the name of the government that had commissioned the desk, the same ally I'd been circling for weeks. Said the arrangement had been mutually beneficial. Moscow got its access, the ally got its leverage. "Why tell me now?" I asked. His smile widened, just a fraction. "Because someone paid to close your case, and I want them to know I can open it again." He stood, left a few coins on the table, and walked out into the snow. I stayed there, staring at the matchbox. It wasn't the proof that unsettled me. It was the realization that every person who'd handled the desk since it left the shipyard had been part of a story no file would ever contain, and I had just been given a piece of it. Years later, long after Berlin had lost its shadows and the wall had become tourist currency, I saw it again. Not in person on the glossy page of a history magazine, wedged between an article on presidential memorabilia and a puff piece about diplomatic gifts. The photograph was recent. The desk looked the same, too much the same. The caption made no mention of where it had been or what it had carried. Just polite words about heritage and craftsmanship. I stared at that picture longer than I care to admit, tracing the grain of the wood with my eyes until I found the faint seam. Still there, still invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. If I closed my eyes, I could almost hear it. Again, the faint, unnatural warmth under my fingertips. The imagined murmur of voices in a language no one was supposed to speak in that room. Some nights, I wonder if the device is gone, or if it simply sleeps, waiting for someone to wake it. Other nights, I wonder if the real message it carried was never meant to be heard through wires at all, but through the silence of those who knew it was there and chose not to speak. A magazine went into the trash, but the picture stayed in. My mind fixed and unmovable, like the desk itself. And if I ever found myself in that room again, I know exactly where I'd place my ear. I keep the matchbox in a locked drawer, not because I'm afraid someone will find it, because I'm afraid they won't care if they do. Time has a way of sanding down the edges of truth until it's just another story for people who think history happens in the open. The faces are gone, the buildings repainted, the files sealed in cabinets built to outlast the men who filled them. But some things refuse to fade. A desk, a seam in the wood. A night in Berlin when I realized the line between ally and enemy was thinner than a sheet of paper. Don't go near the White House now. Don't need to. The picture in my head is sharper than anything they'd let me see up close. And if the voices in that wood ever spoke again. I'm not sure I'd want to hear what they had to say. If you've listened this far, you already know more than most will ever be told. There's more, always more, but not all of it makes it into the history books. Subscribe if you're willing to hear the rest. And in the comments, tell me which part of this you think was a lie and which part you wish wasn't true.